The dusty streets of Silver Creek buzzed with angry voices as Jake Morrison rode into town on his weathered horse. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows between the wooden buildings. Jake had been traveling for 3 days straight, his water running low and his stomach growling for a decent meal. What he found in Silver Creek was not the peaceful rest he had hoped for. A crowd had gathered near the old oak tree at the center of town. Jake could see a wooden platform hastily built beneath its thick branches. 2 nooses swayed gently in the evening breeze, and his blood ran cold. The crowd was shouting for justice, their faces twisted with anger and fear. Jake dismounted his horse and pushed through the crowd to get a better look at what was happening. On the platform stood 2 young Apache women, their hands tied behind their backs. They couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Their dark eyes showed no fear, only defiance as they stared at the hostile crowd surrounding them. The taller of the 2 had intricate braids in her black hair, while the shorter one wore traditional beadwork on her dress that caught the fading sunlight. "String them up," shouted a man in a dirty apron who Jake guessed was the local blacksmith. "They killed Sheriff Watson in cold blood." "Yeah," another voice called out. "Apache savages don't deserve a trial." Jake felt his jaw tighten. He had seen enough frontier justice in his years of wandering to know it was rarely just. The crowd was worked up into a frenzy, and innocent people often paid the price when emotions ran this hot. He studied the 2 women more carefully. Despite their situation, they held themselves with dignity and showed no signs of guilt or remorse that he would expect from cold-blooded killers. "Hold on there, folks," Jake called out, stepping forward. His voice carried the authority of a man who had seen too much violence and wasn't afraid to speak his mind. "What exactly did you see these women do?" A heavy-set man with a star pinned to his vest turned to face Jake. This had to be the deputy sheriff, Jake realized. The man's face was red with anger and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. "They were found standing over Sheriff Watson's body with blood on their hands," the deputy said firmly. "What more evidence do you need, stranger?" Jake looked at the 2 Apache women again. The shorter one caught his eye and shook her head slightly. It was a subtle movement, but Jake had learned to read people well during his years on the frontier. Something about this whole situation felt wrong to him. "Found by who?" Jake asked, crossing his arms. "And where exactly was the sheriff killed?" "What business is it of yours?" the deputy snapped. "This is our town and our justice. You'd best move along before you find yourself in trouble too." The crowd murmured their agreement, but Jake stood his ground. He had wandered these territories for over 10 years, and he had developed a strong sense for when something wasn't right. The deputy seemed awfully eager to get these women hanged without much of an investigation. "I'm making it my business," Jake said calmly. "The name's Jake Morrison, and I've seen enough innocent people hanged to know when things are being rushed." One of the Apache women spoke for the first time, her English clear despite a slight accent. "We did not kill your sheriff. We were trying to help him when the men found us." "Lies," shouted someone from the crowd. "Dirty Apache lies." But Jake stepped closer to the platform. "What's your name?" he asked the woman who had spoken. "I am Ayana," she said, lifting her chin proudly. "This is my sister Itzel. We came to your town to trade, not to kill." Jake noticed something the crowd had missed in their anger. Both women carried traditional Apache medicine pouches, and Ayana had what looked like dried herbs scattered on her dress. These were healers, not warriors. "Deputy," Jake said, turning back to the man with the badge. "Exactly what time was Sheriff Watson found, and who found him?" The deputy's eyes shifted nervously. "That's not important right now. What's important is getting justice for our sheriff." Jake had been a gambler long enough to recognize when someone was bluffing. The deputy was hiding something, and Jake was determined to find out what it was. The sun was setting fast, and if these women were going to be saved, he needed to act quickly. "It seems mighty important to me," Jake pressed. "If you're going to hang 2 people, the least you can do is get the facts straight." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people were beginning to look uncertain, though others remained fixed in their anger. Jake could see he was making progress, but he needed more time to figure out what was really going on in Silver Creek. "The sheriff was found at dawn behind Miller's store," a woman's voice called out from the crowd. "These 2 were kneeling over him with his blood all over them." Jake turned toward the voice. An older woman in a faded blue dress stepped forward. Unlike the deputy, she looked him straight in the eye when she spoke. "You saw this yourself, ma'am?" Jake asked respectfully. "I did," she said firmly. But what?" Jake encouraged her to continue. The woman glanced nervously at the deputy before speaking again. But they weren't running away. They were trying to stop his bleeding with their medicine plants. This revelation sent a ripple through the crowd. Jake could see doubt creeping into some faces, while others remained stubbornly convinced of the women's guilt. The deputy stepped forward angrily. "Enough of this. We're wasting time when we should be delivering justice." But Jake had heard enough to convince him that these Apache women were innocent of murder. Now he had to figure out who really killed Sheriff Watson, and why someone wanted these women to take the blame for it. The plot was deeper than a simple case of frontier justice, and Jake was determined to uncover the truth before 2 innocent lives were lost. Jake knew he had to move fast before the angry crowd lost what little patience they had left. The deputy was clearly trying to rush the hanging, which made Jake even more suspicious about what really happened to Sheriff Watson. He raised his hands to get the crowd's attention. "Folks, I'm asking for 1 hour," Jake announced loudly. "Give me 1 hour to look at where the sheriff was killed. If these women are guilty, hanging them an hour later won't make any difference. But if they're innocent, you'll have 2 murders on your hands instead of 1. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. Some people wanted the hanging to proceed immediately, while others seemed willing to listen to reason. Jake noticed that the deputy looked particularly nervous about the suggestion of investigating the crime scene. "This is ridiculous," the deputy protested. "We know what we saw. These Apache savages killed our sheriff and they need to pay." But the older woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward again. "Maybe the stranger has a point, Deputy Crawford. If we're going to take 2 lives, we should be certain we're doing the right thing." "Thank you, ma'am," Jake said, tipping his hat to her. "What's your name?" "Martha Jenkins," she replied. "I run the boarding house here in town. Sheriff Watson was a good man, and I want his real killer caught just as much as anyone." Jake could see that Martha's words were having an effect on some of the townspeople. The bloodthirsty mood was beginning to cool slightly, though many faces still showed anger and suspicion. "Deputy Crawford," Jake said, focusing on the nervous lawman. "Surely you want to make sure you have the right people before you hang them. What harm could 1 hour do?" The deputy's face grew redder, and Jake noticed sweat dripping down his neck despite the cooling evening air. "I don't answer to you, stranger. This is our town, and we handle our own justice." But an older man with gray hair and expensive clothes pushed through the crowd. By the way people stepped aside for him, Jake could tell this was someone important in Silver Creek. "Deputy Crawford," the man said in a stern voice, "I think we should hear what this gentleman has to say. I'm Judge Hamilton, and I knew Sheriff Watson for 15 years. He was a careful man who believed in proper investigation before making accusations." Jake felt a surge of relief. Having a judge on his side would make things much easier. "Thank you, Your Honor. All I'm asking for is a chance to examine the evidence before these women are executed." Judge Hamilton nodded slowly. "Deputy Crawford, escort Mr. Morrison to the crime scene. I want a full report of what he finds." The deputy's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with the judge's order. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But this is a waste of time." Jake turned to look at the 2 Apache women still standing on the platform. "Ayanna, can you tell me exactly what happened when you found the sheriff?" Ayanna's voice remained steady despite her dangerous situation. "My sister and I came to trade herbs and beadwork. We heard groaning behind the store and found your sheriff bleeding from a wound in his chest. We tried to help him with our healing plants." "Did he say anything to you?" Jake asked. "He tried to speak," Itzel said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was softer than her sister's, but equally clear. "He said something about the ledger, and they found out. Then he became unconscious." The deputy stepped forward quickly. "More lies!" The sheriff never said anything like that. But Jake caught the flash of alarm in the deputy's eyes when Itzel mentioned the ledger. There was definitely something Crawford was trying to hide. "Where exactly was the sheriff when you found him?" Jake continued his questioning. "Behind Miller's General Store," Ayanna replied. "There was much blood on the ground around him." Jake turned to the crowd. "I need to see this crime scene before it gets too dark. Deputy Crawford, lead the way." The crowd began to follow, but Judge Hamilton raised his hand. "Only Deputy Crawford, Mr. Morrison, myself, and Mrs. Jenkins will go. The rest of you wait here and keep calm." As they walked toward Miller's store, Jake noticed that Deputy Crawford kept looking around nervously. The man was definitely hiding something important about Sheriff Watson's death. Behind Miller's General Store, Jake found a disturbing scene. There was indeed a large pool of dried blood where the sheriff had fallen, but something about the area didn't match what Jake had been told. This is where they found the sheriff? Jake asked, kneeling down to examine the bloodstains. That's right, Deputy Crawford said impatiently. Now can we get back to the hanging? But Jake was studying the ground carefully. His years of tracking and investigating had taught him to read signs that others missed. The blood pattern told a different story than what the deputy was claiming. Judge Hamilton, Jake said, standing up and brushing dirt from his knees. This blood pattern shows that Sheriff Watson was killed somewhere else and then dragged here. What do you mean? The judge asked, stepping closer to look. Jake pointed to the smeared blood trail leading from behind some wooden crates. See how the blood is smeared in a line? That's from a body being dragged across the dirt. If the sheriff was killed here, the blood would be in drops and splatters around where he fell. Martha Jenkins gasped. You mean someone moved his body after killing him? Exactly, Jake confirmed. Which means whoever killed Sheriff Watson wanted him found in this specific spot for a reason. Deputy Crawford's face had gone pale. That's impossible. You're just making things up to save those Apache women. But Judge Hamilton was examining the blood trail himself now. Mr. Morrison appears to be correct, Deputy. This blood was definitely smeared by something being dragged. Jake followed the blood trail around the wooden crates and found something even more interesting. Behind the crates, hidden from casual view, was a much larger pool of blood and signs of a struggle. This was where Sheriff Watson had actually been killed. Judge Hamilton, come look at this, Jake called out. Here's where the real fight happened. Among the disturbed dirt and scattered wooden splinters, Jake found something that made his pulse quicken. A small piece of torn cloth caught on a nail, and it definitely wasn't from Apache clothing. It was from a white man's shirt, and it looked expensive. Deputy Crawford, Jake said, holding up the cloth. Do you recognize this fabric? The deputy barely glanced at it. Could be from anyone's shirt. That doesn't prove anything. But Jake was beginning to piece together what had really happened in Silver Creek. Sheriff Watson had been killed by someone he knew, someone who had access to his office and knowledge of his activities. The body had been moved to frame the Apache women, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think Sheriff Watson discovered something that got him killed, Jake announced, and I think those Apache women were set up to take the blame for his murder. The question now was whether Jake could prove his theory before the angry crowd decided to proceed with the hanging anyway. Judge Hamilton examined the piece of torn cloth carefully in the fading light. The fabric was fine quality, much better than what most frontier folks could afford. Jake could see the wheels turning in the judge's mind as he considered what this evidence meant. Deputy Crawford, Judge Hamilton said slowly, I want you to gather all the men in town who own shirts made of this quality fabric. We need to see who might be missing a piece from their clothing. The deputy's face had gone from red to pale, and Jake noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Judge, this is getting out of hand. We have our killers right there on that platform. No, Judge Hamilton said firmly. Mr. Morrison has raised serious doubts about what really happened here. As the acting authority in this town, I'm ordering a proper investigation. Jake knelt down again and examined the real crime scene more carefully. The sheriff had put up quite a fight before he died. There were scuff marks in the dirt showing where two men had struggled, and several items were scattered around that hadn't been there during the staged scene behind the store. Martha, Jake said to Mrs. Jenkins, you said you saw the Apache women trying to help the sheriff. What time was that exactly? Just after dawn, she replied. I always get up early to start breakfast for my boarders. I heard someone crying out and looked out my window. And how long had the sheriff been dead when you found him? Martha thought for a moment. His blood was already starting to dry, but his body was still warm. I'd say he'd been dead maybe an hour or two. Jake did some quick calculating in his head. If the sheriff died around 4 or 5 in the morning and the Apache women didn't arrive until dawn to help him, then they clearly weren't the killers. Deputy, Jake said, turning to face Crawford directly. Where were you between 4 and 6 this morning? I was asleep in the jail, Crawford answered quickly. Same as every night. Anyone else in the jail who can confirm that? The deputy hesitated. No, we don't have any prisoners right now. Jake found that answer very interesting. A lawman with no alibi for the time of a murder was always suspicious, especially when that lawman seemed eager to hang the first suspects he could find. Judge Hamilton, Jake said, I'd like to examine Sheriff Watson's office. If he discovered something that got him killed, there might be evidence there. Good thinking, the judge agreed. Deputy Crawford opened the sheriff's office for Mr. Morrison. I don't have the key, Crawford said too quickly. Sheriff Watson kept the only key. Mrs. Jenkins spoke up. That's not true, Deputy. Sheriff Watson gave you a spare key last month when he went to the territorial capital for that trial. Crawford's lie had been exposed, and Jake could see panic growing in the deputy's eyes. The man was definitely involved in Sheriff Watson's murder, but Jake needed more proof before he could convince the angry crowd. The key, Deputy, Judge Hamilton ordered. With obvious reluctance, Crawford pulled a ring of keys from his pocket and led them to the sheriff's office. The building was a small wooden structure attached to the side of the jail. Crawford fumbled with the keys for longer than necessary, clearly stalling for time. Inside the office, Jake immediately noticed that someone had searched the room recently. Drawers were slightly open, papers were scattered on the desk, and a filing cabinet stood with its lock broken. Someone's been looking for something in here, Jake observed, and they were in a hurry. Judge Hamilton examined the broken cabinet lock. This damage is fresh. The metal shavings are still bright. Jake began searching through the scattered papers on the desk. Most were routine sheriff business. Wanted. Posters. Correspondence with other towns, reports of petty crimes. But then he found something interesting hidden under a pile of other documents. Judge, take a look at this, Jake said, holding up a leather-bound ledger. This might be what the sheriff mentioned to Itzel. The ledger contained detailed records of payments and transactions, but not the kind a sheriff would normally keep. These were records of bribes, payoffs, and illegal activities. Someone had been running a very profitable criminal operation in Silver Creek. Good Lord, Judge Hamilton whispered as he read over Jake's shoulder. These are records of cattle rustling, claim jumping, and protection money from the saloons and stores. Jake flipped through more pages and found entries that made his blood run cold. The ledger showed that someone had been systematically cheating Apache tribes out of their treaty payments and selling their reserved lands to white settlers illegally. This is why Sheriff Watson was killed, Jake said grimly. He discovered this corruption and was planning to expose it. Deputy Crawford had been standing quietly by the door, but now he suddenly lunged forward and grabbed for the ledger. Give me that, it's Sheriff's property. Jake easily dodged the clumsy grab and held the book out of Crawford's reach. Mighty interested in this ledger, aren't you, Deputy? I'm just trying to preserve evidence, Crawford said weakly, but his guilt was written all over his face. Judge Hamilton stepped between them. Mr. Morrison, what else does that ledger reveal? Jake continued reading and found the most damning evidence yet. According to this, someone's been skimming money from the town treasury and falsifying government reports. The latest entry shows a payment of $500 to someone identified only as the Inside Man. $500 is more than most people in Silver Creek see in 2 years, Mrs. Jenkins said in amazement. Jake looked at the date of the last entry. It was from 2 days ago, which meant Sheriff Watson had discovered this corruption very recently. That also explained why he was killed so quickly before he could report what he'd found. Deputy Crawford, Jake said, fixing the nervous lawman with a steady stare. That's an awful lot of sweat for someone who's just doing his job. Crawford's hand moved toward his gun, but Judge Hamilton was quicker. Don't even think about it, Deputy. You're in enough trouble already. Jake realized they were getting close to the truth, but he still needed to prove that Crawford was the killer. The deputy was clearly involved in the corruption, but being crooked didn't necessarily make him a murderer. Mrs. Jenkins, Jake said, when you saw the Apache women helping the sheriff, did you notice anyone else around? Anyone who might have been watching from a distance? Martha thought carefully. Now that you mention it, I did see someone walking away from the area just before I found the women, but it was still pretty dark and I couldn't make out who it was. Can you describe anything about this person? He was walking with a limp, Martha said slowly. A bad limp in his left leg. Jake looked at Deputy Crawford and noticed for the first time that the man favored his right leg when he walked. Deputy, how did you hurt your leg? Crawford's face went white. I fell off my horse last week. But Jake was studying the man's gait more carefully now. The limp was from an old injury, not a recent fall. And more importantly, Crawford had just admitted to being injured in a way that matched Mrs. Jenkins's description of the fleeing figure. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, and Jake was ready to expose the real killer of Sheriff Watson. Jake held up the torn piece of cloth he'd found at the real crime scene and looked at Deputy Crawford's shirt carefully. The deputy was wearing a white cotton shirt that looked expensive, much finer than what a deputy's salary could normally afford. "Deputy Crawford," Jake said calmly, "would you mind if I compared this piece of fabric to your shirt?" Crawford stepped backward toward the door. "You have no right to make demands of me, stranger. I'm the law in this town now that Sheriff Watson is dead." "Actually," Judge Hamilton interjected, "I'm the highest legal authority here, and I'm authorizing Mr. Morrison's request." "Remove your shirt, deputy." "I will not," Crawford protested, his hand moving again toward his gun. "This has gone far enough." Jake noticed that Crawford kept his left arm pressed close to his body, as if he was hiding something. "What's wrong with your arm, deputy? Did you get scratched up during your fight with the sheriff?" Mrs. Jenkins gasped. "Fight? Deputy Crawford, what is he talking about?" Crawford's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand. Watson was going to ruin everything. He was going to destroy the whole arrangement we had worked out." "What arrangement?" Judge Hamilton demanded. Jake could see that Crawford was on the edge of confessing, so he pressed harder. "You've been stealing from the Apache treaty payments, haven't you? And Sheriff Watson found out about it." "It wasn't just me," Crawford shouted. "There are others involved, important people. Watson was going to bring the territorial authorities down on all of us. So you killed him to keep him quiet," Jake said, not making it a question. Crawford drew his gun, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted to reason with him, make him see that we could all benefit from the arrangement." Judge Hamilton took a step forward. "Put the gun down, Crawford. You're only making things worse for yourself." "Worse?" Crawford laughed bitterly. "I'm already a dead man. Do you think the people I work for will let me live after this? They'll kill me just like they would have killed Watson if I hadn't done it first." Jake realized that Crawford was more afraid of his criminal partners than he was of being arrested for murder. That suggested this corruption network was much bigger and more dangerous than just a crooked deputy skimming money. "Who else is involved, Crawford?" Jake asked. "Give us their names and maybe we can protect you." "Protect me?" Crawford's laugh turned hysterical. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. These people own judges, politicians, even army officers. There's nowhere to hide from them." Mrs. Jenkins spoke up quietly. "Deputy Crawford, Sheriff Watson was my friend for many years. He was a good man who believed in doing what was right. Don't you think you owe it to his memory to tell the truth?" For a moment, Crawford's face softened with what looked like genuine remorse. "Watson was a good man. He didn't deserve to die. I tried to talk to him, tried to make him understand that we were just taking what nobody would miss anyway. But he wouldn't listen," Jake guessed. "He said he was going to report everything to the territorial governor in the morning," Crawford continued, his voice breaking. "He had already written out a full report with names and evidence. I begged him to reconsider, and when he refused, you fought with him and stabbed him," Judge Hamilton finished grimly. Crawford nodded miserably. "I panicked when I realized he was dead. I knew I had to make it look like someone else did it. When I saw those Apache women come into town at dawn, it seemed like the perfect solution." Jake felt sick at how close Crawford had come to getting away with framing two innocent women. "So you dragged the sheriff's body to where the women would find it and got them covered in his blood." "I thought it would be quick and clean," Crawford said weakly. "I thought the town would hang them immediately and that would be the end of it." "What about the sheriff's report?" Jake asked. "The one he wrote for the territorial governor?" Crawford's eyes darted around nervously. "I destroyed it. Burned it in the stove at my house along with anything else that connected me to the scheme." "That was smart thinking for someone in a panic," Jake observed. "Almost like you had help planning this cover-up." Crawford's face went pale again. "No, I acted alone. Nobody else knew what I was planning." But Jake could tell the deputy was lying. The cover-up had been too thorough and too quick for one panicked man to handle alone. Someone else had helped Crawford, someone who had experience in making problems disappear. "Who helped you move the body, Crawford?" Jake pressed. "Who told you to frame the Apache women?" "Nobody," Crawford insisted, but sweat was pouring down his face now. "I thought of it myself. Judge Hamilton stepped closer to the deputy. Crawford, if you cooperate with us and tell us who else is involved, I'll make sure the court considers that when you're sentenced. But if you keep lying, I can guarantee you'll hang for murder. Crawford looked around the room desperately, as if searching for a way out of his predicament. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. All right, he said quietly. All right. But you have to promise to protect me from them. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again. Jake exchanged a meaningful look with Judge Hamilton. They were about to uncover a criminal network that went much deeper than anyone in Silver Creek had imagined. We'll do our best to keep you safe, Judge Hamilton promised. Now tell us who else is involved in this conspiracy. Crawford took a deep breath and began to speak. It starts with Marcus Brennan, the Territorial Land Commissioner. He's the one who came up with the scheme to steal Apache treaty lands and sell them to white settlers. Mrs. Jenkins gasped. Marcus Brennan? But he's supposed to be protecting Indian rights. That's what makes it so perfect, Crawford explained miserably. Nobody suspects the man who's supposed to be watching out for the Indians. Brennan falsifies the government reports and diverts the treaty payments into his own accounts. Jake was beginning to understand the scope of the corruption, and your job was to keep local law enforcement from investigating too closely. That's right. Brennan pays me to make sure no reports about missing Apache families or stolen lands ever reach the territorial authorities. I've been covering up crimes for 2 years now. What about Sheriff Watson? Judge Hamilton asked. How did he discover what was happening? Crawford sighed heavily. A Apache chief named Running Bear came to Watson last week. His daughter and 3 other women from his tribe had disappeared, and he suspected they'd been sold to white settlers as servants. Watson started investigating, and it didn't take him long to figure out what was really going on. Jake felt his anger rising. The corruption wasn't just about money. It involved kidnapping and human trafficking as well. Where are those missing Apache women now? I don't know, Crawford admitted. Brennan handles that side of the business.
He has connections with people who buy Indian women to work as servants on ranches and farms far from here. The full horror of the situation was becoming clear.
This wasn't just about stealing land and money. It was about destroying Apache families and selling human beings like cattle. Jake felt his hands clench into fists as the full scope of the criminal operation became clear. Crawford, where does Brennan operate from? Where would he be holding those missing Apache women? He has a ranch about 20 miles north of here, Crawford replied, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's not just him there. He's got armed men working for him, and they shoot first and ask questions later. Judge Hamilton looked troubled. We need to get word to the territorial authorities immediately. This is bigger than anything Silver Creek can handle alone. The nearest territorial marshal is 3 days' ride from here, Mrs. Jenkins pointed out. Those women might be dead or sold off to someone else by then. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. Then we don't wait for the authorities. We go get those women ourselves. Are you crazy? Crawford said, his eyes wide with fear. Brennan has at least 6 gunmen working for him, maybe more. You'll be riding into a death trap. Maybe, Jake acknowledged. But I can't stand by knowing there are innocent women being held prisoner while we wait for help that might come too late. Judge Hamilton studied Jake carefully. Mr. Morrison, you've already done more than anyone could ask by solving Sheriff Watson's murder and saving those 2 Apache women from hanging. You don't owe this town anything more. Jake looked out the window toward where Ayanna and Itzel still stood on the platform surrounded by the confused crowd. The townspeople didn't know yet that their deputy was the real killer. And Jake knew he needed to clear the Apache women's names completely before he left Silver Creek. Actually, Your Honor, I do owe them something, Jake said quietly. I've spent 10 years wandering this territory, and I've seen too much injustice go unpunished. If I ride away now without trying to help those missing women, I'll never be able to live with myself. Mrs. Jenkins stepped forward with determination in her eyes. Then you won't be going alone. I may be just an old woman who runs a boarding house, but I know how to shoot, and I know this territory as well as anyone. Martha, you can't be serious, Judge Hamilton protested. This is far too dangerous for a civilian. Judge, with respect, every woman in this territory is at risk as long as men like Brennan are allowed to operate, she replied firmly. If we don't stop him now, who knows which of our daughters or granddaughters might disappear next? Jake felt a surge of admiration for Martha Jenkins' courage. Mrs. Jenkins, I appreciate your offer, but this will be dangerous work. Are you sure you want to get involved? I've been involved since the moment I saw those two innocent Apache women standing on that platform, she said with steel in her voice. Sheriff Watson was like a son to me, and I won't let his death be in vain. Judge Hamilton sighed heavily. If you're both determined to do this foolish thing, then I suppose I'll have to help too. I'm too old to ride with you, but I can organize things here in town and make sure Deputy Crawford doesn't escape or warn his Confederates. Jake turned back to Crawford, who had been listening to their conversation with growing alarm. Crawford, I need you to draw me a map showing exactly where Brennan's ranch is located and how many men he usually has there. I can't do that, Crawford said, shaking his head frantically. If Brennan finds out I told you how to find him, he'll kill me slowly. Brennan's gonna kill you anyway, Jake pointed out bluntly. You said so yourself. Your only chance is if we capture him before he can get to you. After several more minutes of persuasion, Crawford reluctantly drew a crude map on a piece of paper from the sheriff's desk. The ranch was located in a valley surrounded by hills, which would make approaching it without being seen very difficult. There's a guard posted on the ridge overlooking the main trail, Crawford warned as he sketched. And Brennan always keeps at least 2 men at the ranch house itself. Jake studied the map carefully. What about the women? Where would Brennan be keeping them? There's an old bunkhouse behind the main ranch house, Crawford said. He converted it into a kind of prison for holding people before they're sold off. The thought of Apache women being held in a makeshift prison made Jake's anger burn even hotter. How often does Brennan move his prisoners? Every few weeks. He sells them to different buyers across the territory. But with Sheriff Watson's investigation, he might try to move them sooner to avoid any connection to the missing women. Jake realized they were running out of time. If Brennan got spooked and moved his prisoners, they might never be found. Judge Hamilton, Jake said, I need you to keep Crawford locked up securely and make sure word doesn't get out about what we've discovered. If any of Brennan's other associates are in town, we don't want them warning him. What about the crowd outside? The judge asked. They're still expecting to see those Apache women hanged. Tell them the truth, Jake replied. Show them Crawford's confession and the evidence we found. Make it clear that Ayanna and Itzel are innocent and that Deputy Crawford is the real killer. Mrs. Jenkins checked the ammunition in her rifle. How long will it take us to reach Brennan's ranch? Jake looked at Crawford's map again. If we leave within the hour and ride hard, we can be there before midnight. That'll give us the cover of darkness to scout the place and plan our approach. What's our plan once we get there? Mrs. Jenkins asked. Jake had been thinking about that problem. We'll need to take out the guard on the ridge first, then get close enough to the ranch house to see exactly what we're dealing with. If we're lucky, we might be able to free the women without a major gunfight. And if we're not lucky, Jake's expression grew grim. Then we'll have to fight our way in and hope we can get the women out alive. Crawford spoke up one more time. You're both going to get killed and those women will die too. Brennan doesn't take prisoners. He eliminates problems. Then we'll just have to make sure we eliminate him first, Jake replied with deadly calm. As they prepared to leave Silver Creek, Jake couldn't help but think about how much his life had changed in just a few hours. He had ridden into town looking for a meal and a place to rest, and now he was about to risk his life to save women he had never met from a criminal he had never heard of before today. But something about this situation felt different from the countless other injustices he had witnessed during his years of wandering. Maybe it was the courage shown by Ayanna and Itzel in facing death with dignity. Maybe it was Mrs. Jenkins's determination to fight for what was right despite the danger. Or maybe Jake was just tired of riding away from problems instead of solving them. Whatever the reason, he knew he had to see this through to the end, even if it cost him his life. The moon was high and bright as Jake and Martha Jenkins approached Brennan's ranch from the east side of the valley. They had left their horses tied up in a grove of cottonwood trees about a mile back, and were now moving carefully on foot through the rocky terrain. Jake used his field glasses to study the ranch layout. Just as Crawford had described, there was a guard posted on the ridge overlooking the main trail. The ranch house itself was a large wooden structure with light glowing from several windows, and behind it stood the smaller bunkhouse that supposedly held the Apache prisoners. I count at least 4 men moving around the ranch house, Jake whispered to Martha. Plus the guard on the ridge makes 5, maybe more we can't see. Martha adjusted her grip on her rifle. How do we get past that ridge guard without alerting everyone else? Jake had been thinking about that problem during their ride. There's a gully that runs along the base of the ridge. If we can work our way around to the north side, we might be able to climb up behind him. That's a lot of might and maybe, Martha observed quietly. You're right, Jake admitted, but it's the best chance we have. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Martha's eyes flashed with determination. Those women didn't ask to be kidnapped and sold like cattle. If we don't help them, who will? Jake respected her courage, even though he was worried about putting a civilian in danger. All right, but once we start this, there's no turning back. Brennan's men will shoot to kill. They spent the next hour working their way carefully around the valley floor, staying low and moving from one patch of cover to another. The guard on the ridge seemed alert but was facing primarily toward the main trail rather than scanning the entire valley. When they finally reached the base of the ridge, Jake could hear voices drifting down from above. The guard wasn't alone up there. He had at least one companion, which complicated their plan significantly. Should be back from Tucson tomorrow with the buyers, one voice was saying. Brennan wants all the Indian women loaded and ready to travel by dawn. About time, another voice replied. They've been nothing but trouble since we brought them in. That young one with the braids tried to escape again yesterday. Jake felt his jaw tighten. The voices were talking about Ayana and Itzel's people, as if they were livestock being prepared for market. What if those Apache women try to fight when the buyers come? The first voice asked. Brennan says to shoot any that cause trouble. Dead Indians don't complain about their treatment. Martha had heard enough. She touched Jake's arm and pointed toward a rocky outcrop that would provide them with cover while they climbed toward the ridge. Jake nodded and began working his way up the steep slope as quietly as possible. The climb took nearly 30 minutes, with several heart-stopping moments when loose rocks threatened to give away their position. But finally they reached a point where they could see the two guards clearly. Both men were armed with rifles and positioned to watch the main approaches to the ranch. They obviously felt secure in their elevated position and weren't expecting any trouble from behind. Jake signaled for Martha to stay in position while he worked his way closer. Drawing his knife rather than his gun to avoid making noise, he crept up behind the nearest guard. The attack was quick and silent. Jake clamped his hand over the guard's mouth while pressing the knife blade against his throat. "Make a sound and you're dead," he whispered. The guard's eyes went wide with fear, but he nodded his understanding. Jake quickly tied and gagged the man with strips torn from his own shirt, then signaled for Martha to help him deal with the second guard. Martha proved surprisingly effective at moving silently through the rocks. She managed to get within striking distance of the second guard and knock him unconscious with the butt of her rifle, before he realized what was happening. "Nice work," Jake whispered as they tied up the second guard. "I told you I knew how to handle myself," Martha replied with satisfaction. From their position on the ridge, they now had a clear view of the entire ranch complex. Jake counted 6 men moving around the main house and lamplight coming from both the ranch house and the converted bunkhouse prison. "There," Martha pointed toward the bunkhouse. "I can see shadows moving behind those barred windows. That must be where they're holding the women." Jake studied the layout carefully. The bunkhouse was about 50 yards from the main ranch house with an open courtyard in between. Getting to the prisoners would mean crossing that open space while potentially under fire from the ranch house. "We need a distraction," Jake said thoughtfully. "Something to draw the guards' attention away from the bunkhouse." Martha looked around the ridge and spotted several wooden crates stacked near what appeared to be a storage shed. What if we started a fire? That would certainly get their attention. It was a risky plan, but Jake couldn't think of anything better. "All right, but once that fire starts, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before they get it under control and start looking for who started it." They worked their way down from the ridge and approached the storage shed carefully. The wooden crates turned out to be filled with ammunition and supplies, which would make for a spectacular fire once it got going. Jake used matches from his saddlebags to start the fire. Then he and Martha ran toward the bunkhouse while shouts of alarm erupted from the main ranch house. "Fire! Fire in the storage shed!" Men were yelling as they rushed around trying to organize firefighting efforts. Jake and Martha reached the bunkhouse without being spotted. Through the barred windows, they could see 4 Apache women huddled together inside. One of them was indeed wearing braids like Ayana, though it wasn't her. "We're here to help," Jake called softly through the window. "Are you all right?" A young woman approached the window cautiously. "Who are you? Are you working for the man who captured us?" "No," Martha said firmly. "We're here to take you home. Can you tell us how many guards are usually here?" There are 6 men plus the one called Brennan, the woman replied. But 3 of them left this morning and haven't returned yet. That matched what Jake had observed. Is anyone hurt? Can you all travel if we get you out of there? We can travel, another voice said from inside the bunkhouse. But the door is locked from outside and the windows are barred. Jake examined the door and found it secured with a heavy iron padlock. Stand back from the door, he called. I'm going to shoot the lock off. The sound of Jake's gunshot was partially masked by the commotion around the fire. But he knew it wouldn't be long before someone came to investigate. The lock shattered, and the door swung open. 4 young Apache women emerged, all looking frightened but determined to escape. Stay close together and follow us, Jake instructed. We're going to move quickly toward the valley entrance. But before they could take more than a few steps, voices started shouting from the direction of the ranch house. The prisoners are escaping. They're at the bunkhouse. Gunshots began echoing across the courtyard as Brennan's men spotted the escaping group. Jake returned fire while pushing the women toward whatever cover they could find. This way, Martha called, leading the group toward a cluster of boulders that would provide protection from the ranch house. More gunshots rang out, and Jake could hear men spreading out to surround their position. The escape wasn't going as smoothly as he had hoped, and now they were pinned down with limited ammunition and 4 terrified women to protect. Morrison, a voice called from the darkness. Morrison, I know you're out there. Jake recognized the voice as belonging to Marcus Brennan, the territorial land commissioner who was behind the entire criminal operation. You're surrounded, Morrison, Brennan continued. Give up now and I might let those women live. Jake knew Brennan was lying. The man had too much to lose to leave any witnesses alive, but he also knew their situation was becoming desperate. What do you want to do? Martha whispered urgently. Jake looked at the 4 Apache women huddled behind the rocks, then at Martha Jenkins, who had risked her life to help people she didn't even know. These were good people who deserved better than to die in a criminal's courtyard. We fight our way out, Jake said grimly, all of us together, or none of us at all. The final confrontation with Brennan and his remaining men was about to begin, and Jake knew that not everyone would survive to see the sunrise.